All right, good evening everybody. I would like, in the name of the International Institute for Peace, I would like to welcome you to our first event in the year 2019. I also take this opportunity to wish you all a very, very good and happy and also, let's hope, a peaceful year 2020. I know these days we have been discussing a lot about a very different issue concerning more the Middle East. I mean, what is going on now in Iran and all the security implications for the European Union, for the US and everything. But I'm also very happy that we do not, even these things are happening, do not forget about other regions which are also of very big importance for us, for the European Union, for Austria, for Europe and also the international security architecture. And so I'm very, very happy that today we are able to discuss Moldova. Moldova had, I would say, a very interesting year in 2019. I think many of you would know what happened there, that after the elections there was a very interesting government coalition formed, namely between a more, let's say, pro-Western and a pro-Russian political party. The interesting thing in this case is that this was also supported mainly by all international actors, including the European Union, the US, and it was also perceived as a big experiment. I would say 5 months later, very unfortunately, the government failed due to mistrust votum on the I would say on one of the parties, and the Prime Minister had to step back. So I think it is a very interesting time, and now also if you look at 2020, Moldova will face elections. Moldova is between the Soviet past and also the European path. It is part of it signed an agreement with the European Union, free trade and deep comprehensive trade agreement, and it is also an observer at the Eurasian Economic Union. On the other hand, it also has, I would say, internal challenges. There is still the conflict with Transnistria. It has a long border with Romania, which is also our external border. So I think it is a lot we can discuss today, and I'm very, very happy that we have a distinguished expert here from Moldova, Mr. GROZA. He will be presented afterwards by SWOBODA, the president of the IIP. And you also might have realized that unfortunately Victoria is missing today. She had some health issues which did not allow her to travel, but we will try to connect her via Skype. So I really hope that we are going to have the possibility to hear her as well, because she is former advisor to Ms. Sandu. I think has very interesting views and also interesting views with us to share. I now would also already like to hand over to SWOBODA, and I look forward to an interesting evening. We are going to have an interesting question and answer session afterwards, and welcome again. I hope you enjoy the talk, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. I think the microphone is here. Thank you very much for welcoming us. And of course I want to again welcome GROZA, Executive Director at the Institute for European Policies and Reform, IPRE, in Chisinau, who came and had some time to enjoy Vienna, but now he is with us, and that's very good because he's very well informed. But first we would try, if that is possible, to reach Victoria ROSA. It happened before, but very often it happens when... Victoria, do you hear us? Hello. Wonderful. So, thank you very much for being ready to discuss. Sorry for your health conditions, but I hope it will improve very soon. Thank you very much for coming. Maybe you can tell our guests some words about how you see the situation in Moldova today. What did change? Is it a path away from the structures of oligarchization? How do you see the path Moldova has taken since forming of the present government?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be here and talk to you about Moldova. And of course, I'm very glad that Moldova is in your view, and that we are discussing what is currently happening in Moldova, but also analyzing what happened previously. I think you already mentioned that I'm Victoria ROSA, and I served previously as the security Foreign Policy Association in Moldova. Coming back to Moldova, to the situation that we are having now, I would really like to focus a little bit on what happened last year in 2019, because I think that it was a crucial year for us. And it was a year that we can say that we fighted the oligarchization, but also it was important for the decapturing of the Republic of Moldova. As you all already know, in June 2019, there was a crucial political change in Moldova. It passed through a non-violent but a very challenging change of the government, and for some time we did have two governments in place. Practically, we witnessed the unwillingness of the Democratic Party-led government to step down, but finally it did. And today, I don't know, maybe it was mentioned already, but Secretary Pompeo publicly designated Mr. Plahotniuc, the Moldovan oligarch, but also his family, which means that he and his family have interdiction to visit the United States, and this is practically a great acknowledgement of the fact that Moldova was definitely captured a very long period of time. The Maia Sandu government was formed due to the temporary political agreement between the Bloc ACUM and the Socialist Party, but also backed up by the international community here. I would mention the United States, the EU, but also the Russian Federation, which was a little bit peculiar and definitely raised a lot of question. But we must say that there was a very clear agenda of this temporary political agreement of de-oligarchization and state decapturing. The main objectives of the Sandu government focused on two main pillars. These pillars were practically restoring the trust of the Moldovan people in statehood and in political leaders, but also restoring the trust and to restart the cooperation with the main development partners and, of course, with the neighbors, Romania and Ukraine. This being a very important standing point for us for different reasons, security reason being one of them. The priorities that the Sandu government focused, and it is very important to mention them, because now they are very important points when we are talking about monitoring the further steps that the actual KIK government is doing. And first of all, one of the priority was fight against poverty, justice and anti-corruption reform. Of course, a genuine investigation of the 1 billion theft and bringing to justice the person who were responsible for it. This is one of the also political conditionalities that are imposed by the development partners of the Republic of Moldova. Very important topics would be freedom of media and the freedom of expression and the media pluralism. Of course, ensuring the activity of the Audiovisual Council and demonopolizing the advertising market, which was really important when we were talking about capturing the media environment in the Republic of Moldova previously. Of course, protecting the human rights and liberties through systemic reforms of the healthcare system, social insurance, and the reform of education were one of the priorities as well. But I must say that also a very important focus was due to ensuring energy security and the proceed to the energy sector unbundling. This was a topic very highly discussed in Moldova because it was seen as the only way for Moldova to ensure energy security and to be less influenced by the Russian Federation. But now we will see how this government will deal with the unbundling of the energy sector, because till now we didn't see any discussions on this topic. Of course, a very important topic was uncover of institutionalized corruption scheme in all spheres: transportation, drug industry, regulatory frameworks, properties, and so on. One of the very important standing points was also to restart the cooperation with the civil society, which I still think that it is very important, and we will see how the current government will act in order to cooperate with the civil society, but also not to allow violences against civil society and also all kinds of other interferences in their work. A very important thing, and I will also refer to it in more details, is also the security risks of the country, because it was very important to identify which are those risks, but also to see what is the path of the Republic of Moldova in terms of defense and security. And although the partners of this temporary alliance had different views regarding security and main partners, it was very well from the very beginning understood that the only way that Moldova can modernize its army, but also its security and defense sector, is by cooperating with NATO and with the Euro-Atlantic partners. We must say that the United States is contributing a lot to the defense sector of the Republic of Moldova. Practically each year they are granting about $12 million for the modernization and the capabilities of the Moldovan army. Another important thing, and it is still very important now, and it is quite a challenge for the current government, is to restore but also to continue the cooperation with the immediate neighbors, Romania and Ukraine. And this is very crucial in terms of security, but also how do we plan further common initiatives, Transnistrian issue being one of the most important ones. I have to mention here that the Transnistrian conflict represented a priority in the government of the government Sandu, and also the idea when we were talking about conflict resolution was that democratization of Moldova as a whole should be the precondition for a viable solution. So fighting corruption and ensuring justice is the must for a sustainable resolution of the problem. If we're talking about challenges and how we end up in this situation, I think that the main challenge was the diverse view of how Moldova should develop, even though initially the coalition partners agreed to it. This raised a lot of mistrust among the partners, but also at the end of the day we saw that there were different views of the justice reform and how Moldova should proceed in the future. One of the very big challenge that we have to take it as a lesson learned was the resistance of the administrative system, of the statehood system as a whole, and the lack of performance of the public administrative body. Of course, this has a reason, because during the ruling of the Democratic Party and of the capture state, I would say, process, practically a shadow administrative body was put in place, being in charge of elaborating regulations and draft laws, thus undermining very much the existing bureaucratic system, which practically made it not so functional as the Democratic Party has stepped down from their leading position. A high level of corruption, but also political influence among the heads of public institutions, and of course at the lower levels also played a big role in restoring somehow the trust in institutions, but also the functionality of the public institution. Of course, the big dilemma was the human resources, because for different reasons, migration and the brain drain, which Moldova still faces very much, practically represented a very big challenge for the Maia Sandu government, and the fact that the captured state system corrupted in one way or another a very big part of the civil servants also played a very big role with that. Now, if we're talking about security dilemma, and I referred a little bit to it, but I think that a very important point is now practically how do we see Moldova in the future, and what would be the development of Moldova in terms of security and defense. Of course, as I mentioned, it is very clear that we have only one way to proceed, is to keep and develop the partnership with the Euro-Atlantic partners, but at the same time, the biggest clash of two different military and defense systems and mentalities as well combined in Moldova. On one hand, we have officers which are trained in the West, in Europe and the United States, and we have a big assistance which is coming from the Euro-Atlantic partners. And on the other hand, we still have the reminiscences of the Soviet army, of the Soviet mentality, and of the Soviet system, which is still prevailing in security and defense issues. And there are several reasons for that: poverty, incapacity to perform a fully fledged defense transformation, which unfortunately we are facing, corruption, and of course the Soviet past memory. I don't know how much time do I have. If I still have a little bit of time.
If you can continue about 5 minutes, would that be okay for you?
Yes, perfectly, because I would like to still refer to two very important issues, which are the hybrid threats, if we're talking about security, and here I would refer to cyber and informational security, because at the moment we see that these are two main threats which not only Moldova is facing, but the international community in general. When it comes to Moldova, cyber environment is highly vulnerable due to the lack of knowledge and insufficient understanding of the problem. And I think that this is going to be a big challenge for the future. And this is why we still need to maintain our cooperation with the Euro-Atlantic partners. When it comes to informational security and media environment in particularly, I must say that we are still very much influenced by the Russian Federation and the Russian media. If we look at the opinion polls, we still see that the main source of information and trustful information considered by Moldovan citizens is the national Russian official channel. While we see that also the famous Sputnik, which also has a branch in Moldova, is among the 10 most visited news websites in Moldova, according to a study which was elaborated by Promolex. And also according by the same study, Sputnik is one of the portals which is spreading a lot of information, providing and promoting hate speech, which is not less important. Even though in Moldova we have regulations and legal framework which refers to informational security and also propaganda, unfortunately their performance is very weak and inefficient. I would like to proceed practically to the conclusions, and maybe I would say that practically for the new government, the situation is going to be very difficult because they will have to show the international community that they are committed to the same reform agenda that Maia Sandu started, and I'm not sure that this is how they see their cooperation with the Euro-Atlantic partners. So this is going to be quite challenging, but the message from the Euro-Atlantic community was very well defined. The political conditionalities are staying in place, and if they're not going to be fulfilled, of course, the assistance is not going to be so high as it was for the Maia Sandu government. Of course, monitoring of the justice reform, anti-corruption policies, media freedom, and the defense cooperation initiative will be of a main focus for the development partners. Generally, we can conclude that Moldova was pushed again on the rare seat, unfortunately. Nevertheless, the lessons that we had should be learned, and there should be a new approach towards Moldova. And here I refer more to the development assistance. We should refer to those problems and challenges that we saw last year, and also to try to fix them, even if it is about resources, financial resources, or human capacities, which we lack so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting to describe the different influences in Moldova and the different attractions some people have to the different areas. We will now ask Julian to come in. If you can stay, of course, would be nice, and perhaps answer to some of the questions which would come afterwards. So it's up to you, but of course we would welcome if you...
Thank you.
Okay. Julian, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
How do you see the situation?
Thank you very much, President SWOBODA, for this occasion, and once again, thanks to the International Institute of Peace and also to Ambassador Bushman for the recommendation to come here today, and welcome you as well. Indeed, after the introduction remarks made by Victoria, I think what I'll try to do is try to complement her inputs with basically trying to introduce answers to main 5 questions which were tabled for this discussion. And I'll start with the first one. Will the new coalition hold, and will it deliver reforms allowing to benefit from the EU support? First, there is no official coalition in Moldova now. We have officially a technocratic government supported by Democrats. Both these two parties, Socialists and Democrats, are very shy of recognizing this official coalition. However, the President Dodon already indicated that very soon there will be kind of a reshufflement of this government, indicating to the fact that basically they will try to legalize this coalition, formally entering into a coalition with the Democratic Party, conditioned with some internal reform that the Democratic Party should conduct. Will that happen or not, we don't know, because also internally in the Democratic Party there are different theories, different groups of political representatives that form that party, also the parliamentarians, and there are still discussions among them how to proceed. So, in any ways, most likely the current setup of power in Moldova, formed by Socialists and Democrats, officially and unofficially, most likely will be staying for the next year, at least by the presidential elections, which are set for in November. Will this government, the government of Kiku, which is actually a government of Mr. Dodon, basically majority of the members of the cabinet are former advisors of the president, Dodon very much close to him. Some of them are actually former members of the Democratic Party. Actually, the Prime Minister now, Mr. Kiku, was one of the main masterminds of the financial reform and fiscal reform, which was promoted by Democrats back in 2018. Some controversial reforms, including the investment for citizenship, the fiscal reform, the amnesty, fiscal amnesty and liberalization. That was actually the baby of Mr. Kiku. Looking towards the way how this government is approaching to governance issues, there are some issues which have to be raised. This government is not very interested or into transparency processes. Very important policies which were adopted by the government and by the parliament were short of transparency rules. There was a budget which was not consulted, there was an action plan of the government which was not consulted with non-state actors. Moreover, the government is actually indicating to the fact that they would like to look into the activities of the non-governmental actors, civil society organizations, limiting their space of activities, trying to limit or indicating the fact that they'd like to discourage civil society organizations to be active in political affairs, which is very controversial in Moldova, because probably in French politics means the same word, but politics and policies are different things, definitely, and any attempts to limit the space of think tanks, of civil society organizations, may also signal not very good developments in terms of the way how the government will act. At least the first signs show that at this stage the government dedicates too little time to to involving other stakeholders involved in policies in Moldova. Anyways, this government actually prioritized justice reform, at least declaratively, and that is one of the examples to show that the new government tries to show some continuity, or to try to convince international partners that there is a continuity in what the KIP government is doing, continuing the prioritizing the justice reform as former government Sandu did. However, we have some issues there in terms of credibility of that process. Again, looking to the justice reforms, there are a number of policies, public policy documents, which were tabled by the Minister of Justice, by the government, again, without any consultations. There were a number of laws which were passed by the parliament, somehow promoting a justice reform, but from our perspective, actually undermining the process as such. And there are other things which indicate some issues in terms of practice, of the way how the law enforcement authorities operate these days. There are some questions in terms of the procedural rules, which are, we have some questions in terms of the legitimacy of the process. That is very much connected to the anti-prosecution office activity. Now, as we speak, the former head of the anti-corruption prosecution office is under arrest, is actually arrested, based on a case linked to a criminal case connected to another crook, oligarch, Mr. Plahotniuc, who is actually in prison. And someone would say that today's announcement of the State Department in terms of Plahotniuc becoming undesirable on the US soil may be linked to that process, in a sense that US is trying to show a signal that they would be consistent with the fact that every stakeholders in Moldova have to be very much connected to rule of law, and no actions which would undermine these processes and showing a real fight of corruption in Moldova would actually be tolerated by the international partners. And that is, I think, one of the things which we also have to admit. But otherwise, in terms of the reform agenda of Moldova, one should also look into the broader agenda of this government. From my perspective, or my own perspective, is that this government has one task, and that task is to make sure that Mr. Dodon is elected during the next presidential elections. Because the policies which are promoted by the government are very much populist, if I can call them like this. Again, we're coming back to great projects, also with a bit of mix of Russian funds and Russian credits and investments, also coming from Russian oligarchs, which is also, again, very much controversial, but I'll come back to that a little bit later. This actually leads me to the second question: what role has Russia now in Moldovan politics? And I think the role is very important due to the fact that Mr. President has acquired full control of took over the control of all institutions in Moldova, and this actually indicates that the level of affinity of the president and Socialist Party with Russia is very close, and this actually indicates the fact that Moldova is now under high influence from Russia, probably the strongest one since the collapse of Soviet Union in Moldova. Another influence, Russian influence, is very much about the role of Russian oligarchs in Moldovan economy, strategic infrastructure. There are in the few days of the new government, there were two cases which brought public attention in Moldova. One was very much about the strategic infrastructure of the airport, which was taken over by a Russian oligarch, Mr. Goncharenko, said to actually be very much connected to Russian establishment. He actually took over the airport. The company which manages the airport in Moldova. And another oligarch is actually the son of the current prosecutor general of Russia, Chaika, who allegedly has, and publicly also has, clear connections with the president, and who actually took over half or the majority of the shares of the media company which is broadcasting Russian channel in Moldova today. And that is another indication that Russian influence is very much becoming more present in Moldova. Now, looking at the presidential elections in 2020, one of the questions which was raised for this panel was whether the president will look for EU basically support or to try to get stronger ties with the EU, even though continuing to have much stronger ties with Russia. And the answer is yes. I think Mr. President is looking forward to have warm relations with the EU, with the US. There were some indications, for example, that allegedly the current Prime Minister, when being in Rome, had also meetings with high-level officials from Brussels. Even though that was not very much recommended by EU diplomats, but that was happening, that happened, which actually shows that high-level officials in the EU would try to seek for some channels of relations with this government, somehow going beyond the basic principle of the relationship with Moldova, between EU and Moldova now, which is very much shaped by this conditionality principle of the support of the assistance with the reform agenda in Moldova. This is actually why now practically all EU assistance is suspended for Moldova, waiting for concrete steps in terms of the justice reform, in terms of investigating the high-level frauds, and other important policies, reforms which are connected to the activity of democratic institutions in Moldova. As mentioned, the president is currently and is looking for warm relations with the EU, or at least to imitate some kind of dialogue with the EU, at the same time somehow being aware that the European support in Moldova is still high. Actually, the last opinion polls showed an increase of public support for European integration process in Moldova. There were polls, local polls, but also IULIAN polls indicating that the public support for EU has increased for up to 55% in the last year, which is probably for the first time increase in the last 10 years in Moldova. I personally link the increase of support from Moldovan citizens to EU to the fact that the EU has become in the last 3 years more outspoken in terms of the reforms, in terms of the lack of progress of different governments we had, the fact that the EU was very much consistent to its principles and approach, and that was seen actually also with the government of Sandu, that the support was resumed only after some concrete progress was done in terms of the reforms. The same message was passed to the new government. So basically the consistency of the EU message is very much important, and that actually increased the credibility of the general public in Moldova to the EU, and this actually is one of the arguments why the president will while trying to have this kind of a balanced approach of foreign policy that he tried to introduce over the last half a year, trying to reshape the relationship with Russia, but at the same time keeping somehow EU close. That is in the interest of the president. I don't know why, because probably he learned the lesson of Yanukovych of 2013 and 14. And that actually leads me to the further point of the discussion: what is the strategy of the opposition in Moldova? The first, sub question is how organized is the opposition in Moldova, or who are the opposition in Moldova? For now, the opposition is associated very much with Ms. Maia Sandu and her team, her party, and the public support for Ms. Sandu is still high. She's the second most popular politician in Moldova, and she still has the capacity to mobilize public support around her party and around herself. However, there are some challenges in terms of the partner party of ACUM, Dignity and Truth Party, the last few months showed that there is no common understanding in terms of the approach among the PAS party and Dignity and Truth Party. There is a more kind of approach of having separate political agendas, so basically separating this kind of political bloc which is there. From my opinion, this should not be neither regretful or tragic, because still these two parties have different political agendas, objectives, and the fact that they will have to act independently over the next political cycle may also give some good advantage for both of them, or to reinvent or try to reinvent them in terms of what can be done. But still, the issue of presidential elections is there. Nor Ms. Sandu nor Mr. Nastasi they're not very clear at this stage in terms of the strategy towards the presidential elections. We shall basically see how those develop. We shall look into that in terms of to understand better how these two parties would act in terms of the next presidential elections. But overall, again, when you talk about opposition and why I actually asked the subsequent question, what means the opposition in Moldova today? It's very difficult to answer. Why? Because in any ways, the current political spectrum in Moldova, the public support, mobilized again around Ms. Maia Sandu's party would most likely not be enough for making sure that they would be playing an active governance role in the next period. So they would need other parties, partner parties. So far, there was a lot of discussions about the unionist front in Moldova. Now there are some initiatives of organizing that flank of unionists, which is about 10 to 15%. So far, about 5 parties decided to create kind of a bloc. There is another group, another unionist party, which is going separately. So the positive is that there is a common understanding among these parties that they need to cooperate in order to win more support. Otherwise, the public support, the political support for them is very much fragmented. And there are other political parties which are not in parliament, which position themselves as kind of opposition to the socialists, which appear now, former communists, Civic Congress. There's a new party trying to capitalize on the former communist support, because communist party support is very low now. And anyways, basically, probably this strategy, the best strategy for all the opposition parties, but especially for the pro-reform opposition parties, is to find ways how to win the ground on the center, because very much, I mean, the left flank of the political spectrum in Moldova is more or less concentrated by the socialists. The right wing is very fragmented, and it is very much important that for the current pro-reform opposition party, which is basically around the past party of Ms. Sandu, to take an active stance in terms of governance, they would need to seek for new, probably political forces on the center that they can partner with in order to challenge the current format. Otherwise, the Democrats, as I said in the beginning, formally they are not in government, but de facto they are in government. And as I said, there are already tendencies of formalizing that relationship between socialists and Democrats. And the last point, I think it was about the Transnistrian conflict and what's there for this year in the current developments. In brief, most likely nothing will happen in 2020 on the Transnistrian settlement conflict for different reasons. Or it may happen something after the elections, depending on the results of the elections. From one hand, given the fact that the current political setup in Moldova now is very much linked to Russian interests and Russian influence, so if this dimension would be growing, that would all the influence that Russia has now in Moldova, a kind of a step-by-step process of formalizing the statements which were made so far before, formally or informally by Russia and Socialist Party, Mr. Dodon, about federalizing Moldova may become somehow a reality, but not in 2020. So it will very much depend on the role that the president will have, and if they will manage to present this federalization model in different fashion, not to receive too much criticism from the public in Moldova, because this model now is not very supportive in Moldova. But otherwise, if the support, if to take into account that currently there is no progress in terms of settlement between these two, between Chisinau and Tiraspol, Tiraspol being very much willing to keep somehow the status quo, benefiting as much as possible from the different facilities generated by different processes in the process, indicating the fact that there will be no rapid solution for that process, and this is more likely. This would actually mean that Mr. President would actually phase out from all, I would say, to be more careful in terms of ambitious developments in this process. So most likely not much will happen in 2020 on the settlement, something business as usual, but not more than that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your intervention, which is really complementary to what Victoria said. Maybe first, before we open the floor, a question to you both. In the longer term, or in the basic issue, when a country is divided like your country is, it's not only different parties, but the orientation, Russia, Western Hemisphere, European Union and transatlantic community. How can you deal with this from your perspective, from perspective of the civil society? Is there a historical compromise possible? Is it just a fight which has to go on between the more Western-oriented, hopefully also more reform-oriented forces? This would be also the question if that is identical. If you are Western-oriented, you are reform-oriented, and if you are more Russia-oriented, you're not. Or is the compromise that you have a Western affiliation, but the Russian oligarchs take over the economic and finally maybe also the political power. How do you see not only the year 2020, but the years afterwards? What direction could and should Moldova go with, taking into account that there are these kind of different opinions, this kind of different information channels? You have the Sputnik on the one hand and some other more Western-oriented information sources on the other hand. Maybe first, and then Victoria, if you can answer the question as well.
Well, first, as I indicated already, the public support for EU or Euro-Atlantic integration in Moldova has improved, and that is a fact. But always, over the last years, even in early 2000s, the support for EU Euro-Atlantic integration in Moldova was high, even during communist time in Moldova. And I think that is a fact. And the politicians on the left, on the right, will have to take into account these developments. I think what previously different politicians on different flanks in Moldova did, they actually tried to speculate or politicize the Euro-Atlantic integration process in Moldova, and somehow discredited that process. That actually brought down the public support in Moldova. But the change of strategy of the EU communication, EU presence, EU policy has improved. The politicians in Moldova have learned that talking only about geopolitical vectors is not enough to win general support. So that is also a fact, and this is we have seen with all parties. Democrats 2018 when they actually were basically putting Moldova first. Dodon, Socialist Party, moving from, if you remember, elections to 2016, he was talking about suspension of the association agreement with the EU. Now, socialists do not talk about that. They talk about the need of keeping the association agreement, implementing the association agreement, but also seek for trade arrangements with the Eurasian Economic Union. So, in any ways, I think the role of the Euro-Atlantic integration in Moldova will stay and will be the main, and all political forces will have to deal with it. Now, whether we will manage to use the models of development, the European models of development internally in Moldova, that is a big question. It's very much linked to the political will of political forces in charge in Moldova. Now, as we speak, with the low credibility of the new government, with the low credibility of the political arrangements in Moldova leading the government, in terms of delivering reform agenda, I think we cannot talk about serious rapprochement in terms of values and standards with the European Union. What we see now as we speak, we see somehow Russia being more effective in terms of promoting and projecting and securing their interests in the region, in Moldova in particular, by basically empowering their proxies in the country, and as I said, their proxies also learned from lessons from the past that we have seen in Ukraine. So, in this sense, if we talk about real Euro-Atlantic integration in Moldova, it's very much down to the fact whether the political leadership in Moldova will have enough political will to do and implement reforms, whether citizens will be enough empowered to keep the politicians empowered, and I think that is, and whether EU and US, the main Western partners of Moldova, will be able to adapt to the new setup of environment where Russia is unfortunately becoming more effective in the region and in the country. again, the discussion about resilience, improving resilience, in our countries, particularly in Moldova, is back on the agenda, and this is very much the key to the answer, whether Moldova will be able or not to continue effectively connecting itself to the Western world. One more point: the strategy the EU has now in Moldova is trying to respond to that in a way by targeting the support of different actors of change in Moldova. So it's very much decentralizing the assistance to media, to civil society, to local business, to local authorities. And I think that is on the long run the best strategy to make sure that there is enough capacity inside the country to generate change from within. I think that is, but that is, as I said, costly. It takes, and it's a marathon. It's not a short run. And the big question is how to deal with the effective interventions and actions of Russia, which actually are on a short run are creating obstacles to make sure that Moldova's democratization and Europeanization process is secured.
Thank you. Victoria, you want to come in, please?
Yes, thank you very much. I think that this is a crucial question that you asked for the Republic of Moldova, because we are for a long time speaking about this society division that we have inside the country, but also about the fact that the politicians are using it in order to gain political leverage in the country. And I think that the civil society will play and should play a crucial role in this, because we have to stop the phenomena of shaming and blaming based on the identity that the people have in the Republic of Moldova. I think that more publicly we should discuss issues related to identity, to language, but also to the fact that it is not a shame to speak the Russian language or to speak Romanian language in the regions which are Russian speakers. I think that this should be brought up, and people have to understand that they have the possibility as human beings to deal with their identity as it is, and they should very much make the difference between culture, between identity, and between politics and influences of third parties from abroad. Because we are not speaking about it publicly, we end up in this unlocked situation when these issues become a vulnerability for the Republic of Moldova, a vulnerability which is used inside the country by local actors, but also by foreign actors. So I think, as I mentioned, that civil society and media should play a crucial role in this, and we should put identity and the fact that we have, several cultures, and we develop this as our own identity, and this is an advantage for Moldova and not a vulnerability as it is portrayed at the moment. And in this way, even the population will become more stronger and will have the possibility to enforce those politicians that they consider that are defending their rights. Also, what it is important to mention is that indeed we will have the geopolitical stance in Moldova for a long time, and we will speak about Russian influence, we will speak about the support of the European Union and its position in the Republic of Moldova and of the US as well. But at the same time, I think that what it is important is to focus on the domestic agenda, because no matter who you are supporting, the Russians or the Europeans, you want to have a safe environment, you have to have a good healthcare system, you want to have a justice that it is supporting your rights and liberties. So practically this should be the messages that should be reinforced in the society. And of course, at the end of the day, there are patterns of development which are supported supporting this kind of reforms. In our case, it's the European Pact of Development, and here I must say that for me personally, this is the only pattern that Moldova can follow in order to really practically install and finalize the transition process, the democratic transition process, and to establish functional institutions. Otherwise, practically we will be at the end of the road, all the time. So, from my perspective, I think that this is, of course, a backlash, but we should not give up. We should continue the fight for the democratic reforms in Moldova, and here civil society and media is playing a crucial role. And we should target not only people in the cities, in big cities, in Chisinau, but we should work along with the regions. We should put a lot of emphasis on local authorities, because now we still have this window of opportunity after the decapturing of the state, when people were really afraid to express their position because they were afraid that they will be penalized for political reasons. Now people restored their trust and have the possibility to express freely, and we have to use this window of opportunity so that people can really understand what does it mean to keep authorities accountable. Unfortunately, this is something that in Moldova is not understood till the end.
Thank you very much. Yuri, you said about what you said about identity, and this question is very interesting because in some way, there's a philosophy that states become more and more civilization state. That means they, as Russia, they deliver not only trade and have a good relationship, but also a culture, supporting family values and whatever. Russia, I don't know how exactly that is in Moldova. But so I come to the question to you and maybe also to Ambassador Buxbaum. What is the role of the EU? Do you agree with what Julian said, that Russia is more effective? Could the EU be more effective in supporting either civil society or being more stronger and stricter on the conditionality? So what is Europe in the sense of European Union doing or could do more, and could they do more in order to support the path you mentioned, to the path of reform, domestic reforms, irrespective of if you are more Russian inclined or more Western inclined? How do you see the role of the European Union?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very good question. I fully agree with Julian that Russia is more effective in the Republic of Moldova, and it knows how to win the hearts and minds of the people. And we have reasons for that, and they are well known because the mentality is still there, the Soviet mentality, and we want it or not, it will still be there for some generations still. But if we're talking about the European Union, I think that they have already been a good step when they started to change their communication strategies in Moldova, because if previously they were supporting more political actors after the 1 billion pact, so practically they changed their communication strategy and more focused on supporting the people of the Republic of Moldova and their needs. So this was one of the first steps that I think that was important. The second one is to practically continue to support Moldova even though there are going to be setbacks. Because the Russian Federation policy is practically never to be disappointed. Whatever will happen in the region that they feel that it is their region of influence, even if something which is not according to their plans happening, they will enforce even more their activity in those regions. On the other hand, we notice that when things are not happening the way that the European Union would like, then they are stepping a little bit back, and they need time to think and to restore their policies. Well, this period of time is enough for the Russian Federation to reinforce their power. So for me, I think that one of the best things that the European Union can do is to be continuously supportive to the Republic of Moldova to adjust, as Julian already said, to what is going on in the country. But for this, you really need to know the region, and you really need to know how people are thinking and what is their culture, because we do have a mix of culture. Even now, religion is considered to be one of the most influential instruments in the Republic of Moldova, although Moldovans, not the majority of them are practicing Christian Orthodoxy. But if you look in public opinion polls, church is the first most trusted institution in Moldova. So practically it's a paradox, but this paradox exists. We have to take it into account, and we have to deal with it and to use it in order to promote our ideas and the democratic statehood, but also to speak in the language of the people. Because when you are talking about human rights and human dignity, if you will go in the region and will talk and say this to people and will say, oh, we will introduce anti-discrimination policies for you, nobody will understand it. They will say that we don't need it, we are fine. But when you will talk about disabilities, when you will talk about the fact that people are losing their jobs for political reasons, then people start to understand what really human rights mean for them. So talking in the language of the Moldovan people, this is the secret to get their hearts and minds. And the Russian Federation knows very well how to do it. They have experience with that.
Thank you very much, Julian.
I'll just add a few things. I think as I mentioned, over the last years, EU has changed its strategy and approach, not only in Moldova, but throughout the region, throughout the Eastern Partnership region. This year, 2020, is very crucial in that sense, as we are heading towards the Eastern Partnership Summit, and the new or revised strategy for this policy will be discussed. And in that sense, Moldova is not it's not a peculiar case. Overall, we are faced with the same challenges and opportunities as Ukraine is, as Georgia is, and other countries in the Eastern Partnership region. It's only the difference that Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia, they are more connected by policies, by institutions with the European Union. And in this sense, I think this is the way out to increase the leverage on the political elites in the country. So I think the first thing is to provide and to find opportunities how to find new leverages and ways of connecting policies and institutions from Moldova and the European Union, and providing some combined objectives which would trigger more forced political will, if you want, from the governing elites, and which will benefit more the citizens. Creating this mobility of funds, of people, of capital. I think that is the long-term strategy that we should look into. So basically talking about Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia, and Moldova in particular, is that we need to look and explore how to make the association agreement work more for the benefit of the citizens. Second, EU has to ensure, and EU and US should work together to ensure zero tolerance to crook politicians and to those irrespective who are they in governance or in opposition, but indeed zero tolerance to politicians who would actually benefit and increase their influences in the country by benefiting from state assets and so on and so forth. The developments we have seen in the last 2-3 weeks show actually that we actually witness a takeover of power from Mr. Plahotniuc to Mr. Dodon in terms of political institutions, in terms of assets. Now there is a big discussion about other strategic transportation hub, the port in Giurgiulești, the different airports built by private investments, and so on and so forth. We just need to be very careful to look for assets and interests of those in charge to make sure that they are sanctioned in terms of violations of democratic institutions, rule of law, and democratic freedoms. Second, we have to be, third, we have to be alert whenever some indications show that the space of freedoms in countries like Moldova is shrinking. Both Victoria and me have mentioned about the civil society space in Moldova, which is shrinking even more than before. Civil society is ignored in terms of policy processes. Civil society is basically under the pressure of being excluded from the policy processes. And the image of civil society in Moldova is not helping, because politicians have dedicated enough time previously to discredit the image of civil society, calling the civil society grant eaters, and so on and so forth, especially those who are critical towards government. So to make sure that there is a trilateral or tripartite basically environment of policy discussion between civil society, the government and development partners focused on the reform agenda is crucial. We should really exclude them from there. And that would mean that EU and US should dedicate more funds and to support the capacities, institutional capacities of civil society, not only to produce change on the local level, on the community level, but also in terms of policies. We need to support think tanks, we need to support policy ideas, policy reforms, bring alternative ideas, push them with the government, support them, and advance the reform process together. I think that is very much important. But media is very important, and I think lately, in the last 3 to 5 years, both EU and US have increased support to independent media in Moldova. But I'll give you a few facts. Today, the media in space in Moldova is very much concentrated in the powers affiliated to President Donald Socialist Party, directly or indirectly. But with a Russian element. Some say that the fact that Igor Chaika took over the first channel in Moldova, which was taken over from Plahotniuc, would indicate kind of a solution of addressing one issue of foreign financing of parties in Moldova. Because the 2016 case with the Bahama case of illegal financing of the presidential campaign in 2016 was actually very much linked to the media advertisement for the campaign. And some would say that the fact that now the first channel property moved to Russia, it's basically some kind of legalizing the media support that the president will get in this campaign. Without transferring money to Moldovan entities, but through Russian proxies. So that is another indicator, kind of a red alert, which everyone should consider in talking about media, because the independent space, independent media space in Moldova is very small now. It's about 5% maybe. One other fact I wanted to bring to your attention is that there is a tendency of taking over of independent media in Moldova, online media, for example. One of the very famous and popular media outlets in Moldova, which is unimedia.md, allegedly was taken over by people affiliated to a socialist party today. And when you look Unimedia and their editorial policy now, you will see that there are a lot of news about the government, a lot of news about the president, and lately they started to also apply misinformation activities. I think that is an indicator that you can fund as much as you can the independent media, but as long as you don't have single policies in terms of the media legislation, media activities, the role of the audiovisual council, the role of other entities which have to preserve the independence of media is crucial in that sense. So funding independent media is one thing, but actually creating a proper environment for activity, diminishing the concentration of media in powers of the politicians which actually control the country, I think it should be one of the #1 priorities. How to do that is very much about conditions, about policies that have to be done. Thank you.
Thank you. So we go to the audience. Maybe Ambassador Buxbaum, if you may add some remarks to the European Union side and then or Austrian side, which is part of the European Union, then we go to other questions, please.
Thank you very much. I will be brief. I cannot match the excellent analysis we got. Thank you so much, Victoria and Julian. I think I agree with everything you said. Maybe I wasn't so sure if the last government was working heavily on Transnistria, as Victoria said. But I like very much Victoria's emphasis to respect local culture and identity and not to confound local culture and identity with foreign policy. I only realized it during my last time in just a couple of weeks ago when I was able to go to Tiraspol, to Comrade and to Belz to see the variety in this, albeit small country. And it coincides with what I'm usually preaching in Austria. If you listen to Russian language from Moldova, from Ukraine, or from Belarus, it doesn't mean that those people are pro-Putin. And I think it should be understood, especially in Austria when we speak German, that it doesn't mean we are Germany. But back maybe to realpolitik. We now expect presidential elections around the 9th of November, a little earlier, a little later. Until then, European Union and its member states will watch the present government, maybe a real coalition government, the election results of the presidential elections and what comes later. I wouldn't expect much move from Brussels and capitals until then. Zero tolerance, I fully agree. Austrian, and in particular now with the new government, is always stressing more emphasis on values in the Eastern Partnership. But I can tell you from internal kitchen, this is not broadly or even majority-wise supported by EU member states. We are very close with Sweden and others to say, upon your advice and upon civil society advice, European Union has to be credible and has to insist on values. But this is not as a general feeling, and I hope we will get values high on the next program for the Eastern Partnership, the next 2, 3 or 4 years after the summit. I'm not yet convinced of it.
Thank you very much. If you can pass over the microphone to the gentleman, yes.
Okay, hi. First of all, thank you, Julian and Victoria, for very interesting insights about developments in Moldova. You mentioned the importance of the neighbors, first of all, Russia, Ukraine, and what it was a surprise for me, I think somebody of you only once mentioned Romania, and take into account historical, cultural, sort of what have connection which you have, and Romania being part of EU with very clear pro-Western policies. In a way, you could see win-win situation making bigger ties. However, I'm now talking as an outsider, taking information from outside of media. Never been in Moldova, but reading international press. But
which is a mistake.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is what I admitted, you know. And, the lack of influence of Romania in the political development or or involvement in Moldova. We hear about Russia, we hear about sort of other countries, but we recently saw increase of investment from Romania. Yes, Bank of Transylvania bought Victoria, a few other investments, larger ones, but so there are more economical influence, but less political. So my question is, why? Is it due to Romanian internal problems, political problems? Is it due to Moldovan party's sort of syndrome of bigger brother, you know, sort of, maybe, or maybe something else, you know? So, thank you.
Thank you. I think there was a question behind, yes, the two ladies.
I'm wondering and listening to you, but you never mentioned any economic situation. I don't want to call it problems, but I'm quite sure that the economic situation is influencing the political situation there. So I would ask you to expand a little bit on that.
Thank you. Your neighbor.
Thank you very much, Julia and Victoria. I wanted to know, we talked a lot about Mr. Dodon. Could you explain how much, which role Mr. Plahotniuc plays in the actual technocratic coalition government, how you call it? And I think, or I can imagine at least, that Ms. Maia Sandu is as well thinking of running for the presidential elections. Correct me if I'm wrong. Do you think that she has a real chance there, especially as you said that the main task of this present coalition government is to guarantee that Mr. Dodon is re-elected?
Thank you. Is there another question? If this is not the case, then maybe we can come now to some answers. Romania was a big issue, the economic situation, I may add perhaps the social situation. Poverty is still very strong. Maybe you can also make a relationship between poverty and the poor people and the political affiliation. And then Plahotniuc and Sandu were maybe in running also for the election. So just to repeat, I don't know if Victoria had all these questions. Yeah, Victoria, you want to start?
Yes, I will start if you allow me. So, thank you very much for the questions. Regarding Romania, well, I must say that during my time, I didn't have too much, but 5 months were quite enough. So the Maia Sandu government really had a good cooperation with Romania, and we do have a lot of infrastructural projects which are presented from the part of Romania. But you are completely right that there is not so much political influence for the Republic of Moldova, and this is for several reasons. And you stated very clearly one of them, because the political spectrum in Romania, the continuous political crisis that are in Romania, let them focus less on the situation that happens in the neighborhood. But at the same time, we must say that there is also, but this is my personal opinion, Romania didn't really recovered fully, so that they can really project influence in the neighborhood. So I think that this could happen in the future, but still we are talking about the fact that Romania is giving a lot of assistance to the Republic of Moldova in the manner of giving financial assistance, non-refundable financial assistance, but also building all infrastructural projects. And as well, we must confess that Romania is one of the countries which is considered to be one of the main advocates of the Republic of Moldova in the EU, and somehow promoting the European agenda of Moldova. So when it comes to the political situation and poverty, well, indeed, Moldova, we must say, is a poor country, and we do face critical situations in different aspects. For example, one of the problems that Moldova is all the time thinking about is the energy crisis, and will we have or will we not have gas in order to provide it to the population. How we are supporting the poor or not. And this indeed has an impact on the political situation, but not so much, because if we are looking at people who were supporting, for example, the Socialist Party and previously were supporting the Communist Party, these are practically the most poor layers of the society. These are pensioners, these are people who have less possibilities to have a well-paid wage and so on and so forth. So from my perspective, I think that one of the biggest impacts that poverty is doing for Moldova is the migration, is the very heavy migration, because people who are able to work and who understand that they cannot do it in an environment which is corrupted, where you don't have justice, and where you don't have your rights protected, then you have to leave the country. So I think that this is the biggest impact of the economical instability in the Republic of Moldova. When it comes to Maia Sandu and her participation as a candidate for the presidential elections, this is a very good question, but at the same time it's very difficult, and for me it's very difficult to speculate on that, because until we will not have her position stated, I cannot make predictions on that, but definitely what Bas has mentioned is that they will identify good candidates that can be a full-fledged candidate and who can be at the same level with Mr. Dodon in the presidential elections.
Thank you very much. Julia.
So briefly on Romania, I think you have probably I put it another way. Just to give you a few figures, over the last 3 years, Romania had provided to Moldova over 150 million euros in credits, like in macro-financial assistance, if you want, as being the only single country in Europe that had provided so much assistance, macro-financial assistance, and that is actually in difficult times, when the EU's policy towards Moldova, that was 2017-2018, was very careful in terms of assistance policy, conditionality. So at that time, Romania was very much supportive in that sense. And that is very much because at that time of very close ties between the governments of Romania and Moldova, political ties as well. But talking beyond that, I mean, Romania's policy towards Moldova, it's somehow a consensus policy in Romania. Everyone is supportive of Moldova's European path. Everyone is very much across political spectrum. I mean, socialists or liberals, or everyone is president or prime minister at different times, more or less have the same approach towards Moldova. Romania was very active in order to provide technical assistance. Over 100 million euros was provided to support small or medium-sized infrastructure projects in education or cross-border projects. Romania's part of the trade with the EU is the biggest one. I think Romania is the main trading partner of Moldova, naturally, right? I mean, overall trade balance with the EU is over 70% exports, over 50% imports coming from the EU, and over basically 30% of exports and imports are actually going from and to Romania. So Romania has a very important role in terms of shaping Moldovan development process. I think I would agree with Victoria that in terms of political influence, Romania's role has some limits. For different reasons. But for now, I think, we can definitely say that Romanian policy towards Moldova is very much the same one the harmonized policy of the EU towards Moldova. That was also in time, but again, because of the affinities between Romania and Moldova, from time to time Romania had to play more active advocating role than becoming a more honest broker, because last year we had Romania's chairmanship of the Council of the European Union. We all had high hopes for that time, but again, because of the limits, probably Romania couldn't do much. But also the context did not provide opportunities. Last year, first half of the year was not very stable in Moldova.
But how much did citizenship, Romania gave a lot of citizens of Moldova, Romanian citizenship, help the country, or at least help some people to emigrate into other European countries with the Romanian citizenship?
It's a big issue of migration, brain drain from Moldova. And I think Victoria has referred to that. Over the last, there were some calculations. Over the last 5 years, there were about more than 250,000 Moldovans who left Moldova, which is an important figure. And those who left, they were the most educated, the most qualified. That is a big challenge for Moldova's economy for the short to medium to long run. And that is true that many of them have benefited from the Romanian citizenship. I think now we have over 500,000 Moldovans holding Romanian citizenship, and I think there are more than 1.5 million citizens in the road to get the Romanian citizenship. So probably in the next 15 to 20 years, technically all Moldovan citizens will also become Romanian citizens. And I think that is not that is not a problem. It's actually an opportunity that every citizen is looking for himself. That is also true. So in terms of the support Romania is providing, I think Romania is very active. It's trying to be, as I said, sometimes going beyond the EU policy, sometimes being definitely indicating that Romania and Moldova has a separate or bilateral track record. And
can you just follow on this question?
Yes. Very short.
Very short, yeah. Yes, my question was more on political side, and you've just mentioned that there is huge financial investments which not capitalizing on the political side or influence as from other countries. So my question will be, do you have any resistance from the local parties on Romanian influence, in a way sort of bigger brother syndrome, which I've seen in some smaller countries as well, in relation with the larger neighboring?
Fair enough. From my observation, I think over the last few years, majority of the political parties, even Socialist Party, even the president, who is a pro-Russian, but he's trying to be somehow, as I said, seeking for warmer relations with the EU and with Romania in particular as well. Not very successful, but definitely you would not find political parties, active, important political parties, which would advocate against now Romanian policy towards Moldova. There are some political parties which advocate for the reunification with Romania, and their support is somewhere about 10 to 15%. But the problem for these parties is that they are fragmented, so that the political support is fragmented. And now there is a tendency of mobilizing the political forces around an idea of unification of Romania. And as I said, there are now two main political forces which are somehow consolidating the flank, because until now there were about 9 or 10, and they were getting about 1%, and they were not getting in any local or central political institutions. So that is also true. But otherwise, you would not find very active, important political parties which would advocate against Romania. There is no, at this stage, there is no syndrome of big brother or something like this. More, it's It's about, as I said, also the Socialist Party. I mean, representatives, or even the leader of Gagauz autonomy in Moldova. One of the first visits she had when she was elected as Bashkan, the leader of the region, was basically going to Romania, seeking for Romanian investments, Romanian projects, and so on and so forth. And why I'm saying Gagauz, because 99% of population in Gagauzia, they are pro-Russian. So Romania managed to adjust their strategy and policies over the last years, becoming more strategic, targeting basically very much focusing on assistance, on support, being in a way consistent with your approach, but sometimes going a bit beyond that. So I think that is on Romania. So I think now what we would like to see from Romania, more further strategic approach towards Moldova across institutions in Romania. There is a lot of discussions already for a number of years about the strategy of Romania for Moldova. Again, we should seek more, or look more flesh on bones in that sense. On the economic situation, briefly on the economic situation. Generally, the macroeconomic situation in Moldova is somehow more or less stable. There is a growth in the GDP of last year, I think, 4.5%. There is a projection of about 4% or 3.5% for this year. The policies of this government are very much seeking for increase of social payments and so on and so forth. The challenge for the government is the funds. Without IMF, without EU support, they seek for additional funds, alternative funds to cover the gaps. One of the solutions was voiced already, this $500 million credit from Russian government directed to infrastructure projects. Still as a discussion, we have not seen progress on that at this stage. There is now somehow indications that until the presidential elections, about $100 million will be commissioned by the Russian government for Moldova. There is also indications that these funds, which Russia wants to give to Moldova, they also have taken from some Asian banks, very much connected to China. But that's again other thing. So now, most likely, the current government would seek also for internal sources how to fund the projects, the social projects. The policy, the monetary policy of the bank, which was announced for this year, is very much favoring that. So we probably will seek for more internal credits for the government to cover the gaps and needs. So we would, for this year, probably we will not foresee any crisis. Again, why? Because the focus is for making sure that the presidential elections give the right result. But on the medium to long run, that has to be addressed, and that is actually the problem in terms of the long run policies. The current policies are not sustainable. One more point on the
election.
On the elections, yeah, on presidential elections. So I think it's clear that we will have two main candidates. Ms. Sandu is not hurrying up to announce her candidacy. It's also part of the approach, the political approach that Ms. Sandu is trying to promote. Very much principled, inclusive, consultative, and so on and so forth. We have seen that with the decision that the government Sandu made with the prosecutor office. That is another indicator that basically the political courage that Ms. Sandu has shown is very much about principles, and probably this is also part of the strategy. But probably most likely, ultimately, now as you look, the candidate that can be that can challenge Mr. Dodon is Ms. Maia Sandu. And we will look into that. Why the candidature is not announced now? Again, probably that is a strategic approach, strategic, I mean, not to, how should I say, not to become a target as much as possible. And I think there was a mention about the question about Plahotniuc role. I think with today's announcement of the State Department of announcing Mr. Plahotniuc undesirable, his positions in Moldova are weakened even more. His role in the formation of this coalition, the Democrats, Socialists and Democrats, some would say that it's very little. But definitely, one would say that Mr. Plahotniuc still has his connections with part of the party of the Democratic Party. What is also true that it is not the majority group in the Democratic Party, and that is so. If to put it in an easy way, the level of influence of Mr. Plahotniuc at this stage is quite low. Also weakened by the international, basically, recognition that today the U.S. State Department announced.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you very much, Julian, for your patience also, Victoria. And of course, we hope to see you in reality also sometime, either here or visiting you in Moldova. I think that was very interesting what you said. Unfortunately, in some way we had perhaps more hopes last year than we got at the end. This year, well, the year before, but we got in the end. Maybe the election will have some change. Anyway, the complicated situation and the different orientations are there, and will not be easy to overcome, but we hope that the EU will be strong enough to find a way, and let's hope that Romania will be stronger in time also to play a more effective role in your country, but irrespective of that, of course, we want to have that Moldova can be able to keep its independence and to implement also independence, and some of the oligarchic structure, either domestic or Russian, will be not strong enough to prevent reforms and the democratic development. There is some small drink for you. Unfortunately, no wine from Moldova. I don't think we have, which is very good, so I can also advise to go to the country to see a beautiful country, a very interesting country, and also drink very good wine. And let's hope also that the democratic development will be nearly as good as the wine already is. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you again.